All right, we're going to go over part two of our notes on the roles of the president. We're just going to kind of briefly recap what we did last, I guess it was Monday. Um, so obviously, the president has a lot of different duties. We know him mostly as the head of the executive branch. Executive branch is covered in Article 2 of the Constitution. Um, He has all these official duties as head of the executive branch, but then we also know that a lot of those duties kind of come by tradition. They were once set up by George Washington and some of the presidents that came right after him. Um, but those duties have sort of been cemented as roles of the president. Term of office, uh, elected for 4 years at a time. Because of the 22nd Amendment, the president can now serve a total of 2 terms. As far as checks and balances, the president has a lot of leeway to do what he feels is necessary between executive orders, executive agreements. However, he cannot make laws himself. That is left up to Congress. Um, and, the president needs approval by Congress for major appointments, such as people to serve in his cabinet. Um, President gets to make appointments to the Supreme Court, however, also needs Senate confirmation of those appointments. Um, and then waging war uh, in order to actually declare war, that also takes an act of Congress. And then serious wrongdoing for impeachment, if the president does something that's considered a high crime or misdemeanor, uh, the House can impeach the president, and the Senate then has a trial on whether or not to remove the president from office. Qualifications, we don't need to worry so much about the salary right now. You went over that already. Just to recap, though, qualifications, you have to be 35 years old, be a natural born citizen, which we don't necessarily know exactly what that means. But the courts have kind of agreed that you have to have been a citizen from birth, not a naturalized citizen. And you have to have lived in the U.S. for 14 years. And then, like we said, President Washington pretty much set the example for what it meant to be president, and other presidents followed in his path. Okay, so now we're going to go over the actual defined roles of the president. Some of these are, again, outlined in the Constitution. Others have come by tradition. Commander-in-Chief. The President of the United States is Commander-in-Chief of the Army and the Navy. That is outlined in the Constitution. The Air Force is not mentioned. Coast Guard, those aren't mentioned because we didn't have that when the Constitution was written, but it's understood that the president is also the head of those branches of the military as well. During time of war, the president is the one that is going to make the most important decisions. Most presidents are going to rely on their advisors, both military and civilian advisors, but ultimately the final decision on things that does fall on the president. Probably the biggest example of this would have been with Harry Truman deciding to drop the atomic bombs on Japan. This was something that had been in the works for some time under President Roosevelt. President Roosevelt dies, and there's a lot of people coming to Truman saying, "Hey, okay, we have the bomb, it's ready. We're going to use it on these dates." And Truman told them, "No, it's his decision. It's not somebody else's. Whether or not Roosevelt had plans for that or not, ultimately it was Truman's decision." And he did eventually decide to use the atomic bombs. But that just shows that it's the president that makes those decisions, not his other advisors. All right. The president can send U.S. troops abroad, can send them to do different military actions. Like we mentioned before, we haven't actually declared war since World War II. However, it doesn't mean that we haven't had major conflicts that we would consider to be wars. Biggest ones, the Korean War and the Vietnam War. Um, you'd be pretty hard pressed to find somebody that fought in those conflicts that don't think that it was a war. Um, you know, we just didn't call it that. We didn't have a declaration of war. So pretty much the president can do what he wants with the military. Um, if it would ever be a situation where the majority of Congress didn't feel that what he was doing was appropriate, they could withhold funds, and that would pretty much put a standstill to whatever was going on. That would be um, a pretty big decision to make, and fortunately, we haven't had a situation that was like that. All right, the president is also our nation's chief diplomat. Um, when it comes to foreign policy, which the president is in charge of basically two types of policy: domestic policy, which is plans for the country, the economy, how things are going to happen within our borders. And then also, he is leading in foreign policy, which that would be the guide for planning, how we're going to interact with other countries abroad. Um, you see here that's President Carter in the middle, and on the right is I'm drawing a blank on his name now, but um, on the left it's Anwar al-Sadat. This was the Camp David Accords, which basically brought in um, um, the Israelis and then the Egyptians, two conflicting groups, and President Carter helped broker a peace deal between them. Um, and so we have treaties. That's a formal agreement between nations. The president can enter into the treaties. However, that's something that needs approval by the Senate in order for that to go forward. Ambassadors, those are official representatives that are going to be sent to the foreign governments. This is something that uh, the president gets to appoint ambassadors, and then they have to be approved by the Senate. It's very rare that there's much of a controversy over who the ambassadors are going to be. It's usually people that have good working relationships with those other countries. So it's not uncommon to see a Democratic president appoint somebody, and then a Republican president comes in, and those those ambassadors might stay, and they might bring in their own people, but it's really not a big political ordeal. So usually those appointments are approved fairly easily by the Senate. Okay, and then we also have executive agreements that the president can enter into. An executive agreement is much like an executive order. Um, it's but in this case, it's a treaty that is in effect while that president is in office. Does not need Senate approval for this. Um, he's got the power to enter into this, and then it's basically just an agreement that um, while his administration is in office, that agreement will be honored. Doesn't have the binding legal authority that a treaty does, but it's a way that the president can work with other countries without having to go through the hassle of getting something approved by the Senate. Um, oh, and then the the photo there with the Camp David Accords. You've got Anwar al-Sadat on the left, Jimmy Carter in the middle, and then in the on the right, it's Prime Minister Begin from Israel. And this was a huge deal, bringing together the Egyptians and the Israelis, two groups that didn't really like each other, really hated each other. Um, and they were able to come to some common ground and find a peace there. However, the sad part was Anwar al-Sadat on the left. He was assassinated not too long after this um, by people that weren't fans of him working with Israel to negotiate a peace. All right, the president as legislative leader. We know Congress makes laws. However, they are expected to consider the president's advice. In fact, the Constitution states that it doesn't actually say that he has to give a State of the Union every year. However, he has to update Congress on the state of the nation periodically. By tradition, this has been once a year, usually in January. The president will hold a joint session of or will attend a joint session of Congress led by the vice president, who's the president of the Senate, and the Speaker of the House, who leads the House of Representatives. And the president will give a speech and basically outline what he wants for the country moving forward. And Congress is simply just expected to listen to this. They don't have to do exactly what the president says. They don't have to do anything what the president says. However, they do have to listen to him when it comes to advice on how to move the nation forward. Domestic policy, we talked about that before. That's just the policy on what we're going to do within the country. Usually things like national security, the economy, those are big things with domestic policy. All right, probably the president's biggest active role in as a legislative leader is signing bills into law. Once it goes through both chambers of Congress, it goes to the president's desk, and he can either sign it or he can veto it. There's a couple other things too, but we're not going to be concerned with that just right now. But the veto, this is where the president rejects a bill. It could then go back to both chambers of Congress, and it could pass with a 2/3 majority. However, that would be a veto override, and only about 4% of vetoes have ever been overridden. So usually when something is vetoed by the president, it typically dies. There are examples even recently of that not happening, but that is historically, that is the way things have gone. Okay, the last thing is the president is expected to create a budget, and it's then up to Congress to approve that budget. We hear a lot of times about bickering between Congress and the president over a budget. However, the majority of the budget is usually approved by Congress. There are usually going to be just little sticking points that Democrats want something or Republicans want something else. So if you have Congress and the president in different parties, you might have some issues with that. But for the most part, the big chunk of the budget is usually approved without any problems. And the president is not the one that comes up with the budget by himself. He has the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, where the president kind of gives the ideas, and then the OMB tells him how much those are going to cost, and they work out a budget that way. Really, when it comes to judicial powers, the president doesn't have a lot of actual what we would consider kind of day-to-day judicial powers. However, it's more big picture things. The president chooses Supreme Court justices as well as all other federal judges. Needs Senate approval for that. But once approved, those justices really carry on the president's ideas long after he leaves office. The other thing is the president can reduce punishment for people convicted in federal courts. He can also grant pardons, which wipes away a crime. Okay, so some of these roles that have been created more by tradition and not mentioned in the Constitution, being a party leader for his political party. The president is going to be the top leader of his or her party. President Biden is a Democrat. it would be pretty hard to say that he's not the leader of the Democratic Party. There might be other strong voices in the Democratic Party, but Biden is the president, and so as the top person in his party, he's going to be considered the party leader. And then chief of state, mentioned this at the very beginning of these notes. Chief of state, he really speaks for the entire nation. Gives out presidential medals to citizens. Presidential Medal of Freedom is the biggest one. President is in charge of welcoming foreign leaders and kind of using the White House as that stage to welcome in these leaders, attending foreign funerals. Here you see, this is Pope John Paul II, his funeral, and you have actually multiple presidents here, but George W. Bush was the president at the time, so he was there as like the official representative of the United States. But then you also have President Clinton here as well, and I believe those are the only two. But I think that might be Donald Rumsfeld there, not George H.W. Bush. But even though obviously President Clinton was there, George W. Bush was the president at the time, so he would have been the official representative of our nation. Other times, the vice president might go in their place or the secretary of state, but you're going to have some type of representation at a major foreign dignitary's funeral. So that is all that we have for the notes. Tomorrow, plan on having an assignment, and then you will all be back here on Monday in class learning. We'll move on to the next section of notes then. So until then, make sure you check back tomorrow for your assignment. But then I will see you all on Monday.